Hello from the Heartland. My name is Jenna, and this is Smarter News. News when it matters and why it matters. Our Smarter series features unique people who help us think and live smarter. So I want to start this conversation off a little bit different with a bit of a personal story. So my mother is first generation Italian American. Her father, my grandfather, was born in Italy, and he came through Ellis Island with my great grandmother as a little baby. In fact, she traveled with two little babies, I would say, a toddler and an infant, which was my grandfather. And I just want to note, I have trouble enough getting all my kids in the car to go to Target, let alone getting on a ship from Italy, traveling for more than a week to America to go through Ellis Island and wind up in California, where my mother's family eventually settled. But as part of my mother's history, there's a couple images that are really salient in my mind that she has had in her bedroom over the years. And her bedroom is not a place that I went very often as a kid. You know, it's your parents' room. There's a lot of important stuff in there. And some of the important stuff really illuminates this history. So she has a trunk that my great grandmother and her father carried through Ellis Island. She has some rosaries, things like that call to mind her Italian Catholic heritage. And then she has this print, and she's always had this print up of Betsy Ross sewing the first American flag. And there was just something about this print that always spoke to me. I just thought it was beautiful. It's got the image of this big flag on the lap of Betsy Ross, and she's sewing this flag. And it was just something really special that really stuck in my mind. A good lesson to parents everywhere. You never know what your kids are really going to pick up, because I don't know if my mom would think, oh yeah, that's what she's going to remember from the bedroom. Right. But I remember that so clearly. And really for most of my life, I thought Betsy Ross sewed the first American flag. I mean, that's what we've always talked about. Betsy Ross sewed the first American flag. And it wasn't until I started to do some more reporting on Smarter News, and where we look into some historical dates like Flag Day, that I stumbled upon the wording in the Library of Congress that called this a legend and said that there was no actual real confirmed evidence that Betsy Ross actually sewed the first American flag. So this was earth-shattering to me. You know, there's even a doubt. I didn't know that there was even a doubt. And you're telling me of the 173 million items in the Library of Congress, no one found a receipt somewhere? Like no one found a receipt in a pocket of a pant to say, this is the receipt. This is the actual evidence that Betsy Ross sewed the first American flag, which then brings us to the question, who did? But there's a lot to unpack here. And we actually have a great opportunity to talk to someone that knows a great deal about this subject. Lisa Moulder is the director of the Betsy Ross House, and she's been part of the Betsy Ross House for more than 20 years, served as curator, looked through the entire collection. We're going to talk a little bit about the Betsy Ross House and how historic it is and how dynamic Betsy Ross is. But Lisa, I have to just start with this question first before we get into Betsy and who she is and who she was and all that we need to know about her. Why do we believe, if it is a legend, it's a pretty powerful legend, Lisa, right? It's not just like something people say, flippantly. Like we really believe that Betsy Ross sewed the first American flag. So why do we believe that? Where did that even come from?
Yeah, so her grandchildren were the ones who shared the story publicly for the first time in 1870. Betsy Ross passed away in 1836. But upon her death, her daughters, her nieces who lived with her, her grandchildren, they all started, amongst themselves, they were talking about how they wanted to share Betsy's story. They signed sworn affidavits in front of notaries saying, this is the story we heard from our grandmother. And then in 1870, Betsy Ross's grandson, who I believe she was 11, he was 11 years old when she passed away, but he recounted in front of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania that when he was a boy, he heard the story from his grandmother about how she was visited by a committee of 3 men, which consisted of George Ross, who was her husband's uncle, Robert Morris, who was a financier of the American Revolution, and George Washington, and was asked to make the first American flag. She said she'd never made one before, but she would try, which she did. And then a couple weeks later, she presented the flag, this prototype flag, to the gentleman, and they approved it, and it became the first flag of the United States. Even then in 1870, it was a story that was really just known locally. It was picked up in some newspapers, but it really wasn't widely known. It wasn't until 1893, the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, when Charles Weisgerber, who was our museum's founder, he had painted a depiction of Betsy Ross presenting the finished American flag to those three gentlemen. Maybe that's the print that your mother had in her house. His painting was 9 feet by 12 feet. It hung in the Pennsylvania Pavilion at the World's Columbian Exposition, which was visited by tens of millions of people. So from there, she became a household name because so many people were introduced to Betsy and her story when visiting the World's Fair. Charles Weisgerber then came back to Philadelphia. What is now the Betsy Ross House Museum was being run as a tavern. And he said, this place is far too important to be a tavern. This needs to be a museum dedicated to Betsy Ross and the first American flag. So he started an organization, sold 10-cent memberships, lifetime memberships to this organization. He ended up selling 2 million memberships and was able to raise far more than enough money to purchase the house, preserve it, and turn it into a museum. We've been a museum ever since. That was in 1898. Aside from the story being shared by Betsy Ross's grandson and Charles Weisgerber, there's a lot of circumstantial evidence. I mean, we don't have that smoking gun. Unfortunately, we don't have a letter from George Washington thanking Betsy Ross for making the first flag, or we don't have notes in Congress's journal saying that Betsy Ross was paid for making the first American flag. But the circumstantial evidence we have is that Betsy Ross is, according to her story, she was visited by George Ross, Robert Morris, and George Washington. George Ross was her husband's uncle, as I had said. She'd been recently widowed, and he probably knew that she needed some money and that she was a skilled upholsterer and had the skills needed to make an American flag. In May 29th of 1777, there is a record that Betsy Ross was paid by the state of Pennsylvania for making an American flag. That's 1777. So the story was attributed to her in 1776 by the family, but it's possible that they had just mixed up the date a little bit. That's strong evidence that she was paid for making flags. And that record still exists in the state archives of Pennsylvania. But to me, the biggest piece of evidence, which actually just came up not that long ago, was that when the curators of Mount Vernon were getting ready to recreate George and Martha Washington's bedchambers, they wanted to create new bed curtains and chair covers. They basically wanted to redo George and Martha Washington's Mount Vernon bedroom. They wanted to see if there was some evidence in George Washington's records to see, what kind of fabrics they used and that sort of thing, so they can make the most accurate recreation of the bedroom. And in that record of George Washington, they found that in 1774, when he was in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress, he paid Betsy and John Ross, her first husband, for making bed curtains for Mount Vernon. The fact that, as such a powerful man, he had access to any upholsterer in the country, but he chose Betsy and John Ross to make these bed curtains for his home hundreds of miles away in Virginia. That shows that, 2 or 3 years later, when the first American flag was commissioned, he was familiar with Betsy Ross's sewing skills. He was a customer of hers in the past. So that shows to me that he is, very strong evidence that he wanted somebody that he trusted, he knew she would do a good job. So he went to her a couple years later and with that important flag commission.
And how would he have known her? How would their paths have crossed in Philadelphia?
Well, it's interesting because so Betsy and John Ross, they met as apprentices, as upholsterers in John Webster's upholstery shop. John Webster was one of the most famous upholsterers at the time in Philadelphia, most fashionable upholsterers. So they met as young upholsterers there. So when they finished their apprenticeship and went off to start their own business, they were immediately getting very important and powerful customers. Now, these names may only be known in Philadelphia, but some of the, well, Ben Franklin, of course, everybody knows who that is. Ben Franklin was one of their customers, but the Cadwalladers, the Chew family, these were all people involved in government. These were all very wealthy people. We know that Benjamin Chew, shortly after Betsy and John started their very own upholstery business, hired them to basically refurnish his daughter's entire house as a wedding gift. Shortly after he hired Betsy and John to refurnish Elizabeth Chew's house, George Washington had dinner with Benjamin Chew. And then a couple months later, George Washington was hiring Betsy and John Ross to do the curtains in Mount Vernon. So we think it was a word of mouth thing, just a recommendation from an acquaintance of George Washington.
The 1770s version of going viral. They were the
Right.
hot new, they were the hot new upholsterers in Philadelphia, and they were this young couple. Talk to me a little bit about Betsy Ross and John Ross. She kept his name, or we know her by his name,
Right.
but they had a little bit of a Romeo and Juliet romance, and he also died very young, making her a very young widow. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, now, well, even in the 18th century, Quakers were the first, the first group of people who really fought for social justice issues, prison reform. They were the first abolitionists. They were very open-minded, still are to this day. But the one thing that was an absolute no-no in the 18th century, aside from being involved in war, because they were pacifists, was marrying outside the faith. And Betsy Ross fell in love with an Anglican. John Ross was an Anglican. She was from a long line of Quakers. And she was, her family, her faith did not permit a marriage between an Anglican and a Quaker. So they eloped. One cold night in November, they took a ferry over to New Jersey and married in a tavern. And came back to Philadelphia and reported their marriage to their families and to the Quaker leaders. And essentially her family and the Quaker leaders said, what you did was not right. And if you come before a committee of Quaker elders and admit that what you had done was wrong, you can continue to be married to John Ross, but then you will also be allowed to worship as a Quaker again. Betsy Ross refused to accept that what she did was wrong. She said, she followed her heart. She fell in love with a man of another faith, and there's nothing wrong with that. So she refused to make that statement in front of the Quakers. So she was excommunicated from the Quaker faith. So she worshiped for a while at Christ Church with John Ross, and his father was assistant rector there. She did eventually rejoin the Quakers. A more liberal form of Quakerism was formed in the 18th century during the Revolutionary War called the Free Quakers, which they were okay with marrying outside the faith. They were okay with participating in the war. So she must have still been a Quaker at heart. So she did rejoin them later as a Free Quaker. But yeah, so she was excommunicated. Lost touch with her family for a period of time. Their marriage, unfortunately, only lasted 2 years, and he died under some mysterious circumstances. We know there was mental illness in his family. There were some reports from the family that over time he started writing down just sort of nonsense. So we don't know if he was, fell victim to mental illness as well, but we do know that he died, leaving Betsy a very young widow.
Wow. I was seeing a lot of different reports about him, just to kind of orient ourselves, because this is always helpful. When I think of the American Revolution, I think of 1776, but when we look at the span of time of the American Revolution, it's a long war. Some would suggest that it's 1775 that it actually begins and then goes on to 1791. And so there's some that even suggest that maybe he was part of a militia, right, Lisa? There's all sorts of sort of these, how was he involved? And was this kind of a young revolutionary couple in a lot of ways, in tune with those that wanted to fight for America's freedom? Would you describe Betsy Ross that way? Did she have that? Obviously she had an independent streak if she was going into business with someone that marrying and then going into business, being a very, obvious businesswoman at a time when maybe there's not a lot of that. Did she have a strong kind of revolutionary streak? Would you describe her that way? Was she for America's independence?
We believe so. Her family did say that she was for independence. She certainly was no loyalist. I think, she did in some sense need to sort of remain a pacifist as a Quaker. But, she contributed to the war effort in her own ways. All three of her husbands, so she was married 2 more times. She was married and widowed 3 times. All 3 of her husbands fought in the American Revolution. John Ross did fight in the militia. Her second husband was a privateer. And her third husband was wounded badly in battle, which eventually led to not complete paralysis, but some serious mobility issues later in life, which is another thing that Betsy Ross had to take on, the care of a husband who, couldn't work, supporting the family. But yeah, between the fact that her 3 husbands all were active in the war, all fought in the war, and the fact that she took on this commission of making an American flag, which would have been considered an act of treason. And upon her second marriage, when her husband was off to sea, we were in the deep into the war. She most likely was not getting a lot of upholstery commissions at this time. People weren't thinking of, oh, I need beautiful new, curtains for my bedchambers when, we're in the middle of a war on our homeland. So she was struggling for money. So she took on another commission, making musket cartridges for the Pennsylvania militia. So yeah, those were the flag making and the musket cartridges. Both were acts of treason. At the very least, she could have been arrested if she were caught. Worse, she could have been executed. So yeah, I would say she was a patriot.
Yeah, you think about just the act of sewing a flag would be viewed as treason. We have a hard time of thinking about the bravery and the courage that so many put on the line, for America's independence, which we're just a few days away from celebrating. So although there's some debate about her sewing the first American flag, is there any debate about her being a flag maker, Lisa? And is that that's established, right? That she has.
Right. Like I said, and there's a receipt, government receipt from May 29th, 1777, where she was paid for making colors of the United States, or naval colors, I believe it is. So that's for certain. Later in life, she went on to make flags with her daughter. They started a flag making business for 50 some odd years, and even advertised in local newspapers their flag making activity. So she 100%, I think primarily upholstery was her thing, but then took on some other sewing work as well, including flag making.
So she had her storefront, and then she had her Etsy shop. That was the,
right.
I'm using this, you can think about, we're not all that different then, but, obviously there's some very distinct things about this story. So as I was researching this and preparing for this interview, I found myself saying, okay, well, there's a lot of people that are saying, well, we don't have confirmation that she sewed the first American flag. But Lisa, if it's not Betsy Ross, then who is it? Do we have another strong contender of someone that would have sewed the flag?
There are other flag makers in Philadelphia at the time, but I mean, there's also no smoking gun as them being the first flag makers either. So I really don't understand, the naysayers' hatred. I mean, maybe hatred is a strong word, but just, they're doubters. Refusing to accept that Betsy had anything to do with making the first American flag. I mean, I don't understand it.
Well, that's interesting coming from you, who have looked through so many different artifacts, for lack of a better term. I mean, maybe that is the term to use, as part of the Betsy Ross House, which I want to get to in just a moment. The name that I saw come up, just because I'm curious what you think about this, is Francis Hopkinson, who signed the Declaration of Independence and apparently designed the seal, or that there was some sort of receipt found from him that said that he had sewed, quote unquote, the flag. But this is a couple years after Betsy Ross would have sewed the first American flag. And on that, so first of all, I'd love to know your thoughts on that. But second of all, the American flag, the first iteration of it, was it prevalent? Was the first flag flown by revolutionaries all over the country at the time, or was it a rare thing to have an American flag? So this is a
Right.
two-part
Well,
question. You could
yeah.
take it any way you'd like.
Sure. So to answer your first question about Francis Hopkinson, he actually submitted a bill to Congress asking for payment for his design of the first American flag. So not for actually stitching it, but he tried to take credit for designing it. And interestingly enough, Congress declined to pay him. And he didn't ask for cash. He asked for a quarter cask of wine as payment for designing the first American flag. Congress said, no, we're not going to pay you for this. We can't give you credit for making the first American flag because a lot of people contributed to the design of the first American flag. So even though there's documented proof that Congress said, absolutely not, we're not paying you for your design because you were not the only one who made it, he's still considered the father of the American flag.
Come on.
Right.
And he was asking for wine. Can you imagine if that was happening today?
Right. Right.
Okay. All right. So, I mean, that's literally the only other name I saw that was in a National Geographic article about this. But I have, I was wondering if you never know when you start reporting on a topic, maybe there's an unsung hero that we're ignoring, but really that was the only name that came up.
Right.
So
and
what about go ahead.
Oh, and then we don't give Betsy credit for designing the first American flag. That's not the case. According to her family, she was approached by these three gentlemen with a design already. They had a sketch of what they were thinking for an American flag and showed it to Betsy. We do say, and again, this is according to her family, that she noticed that the stars on the design that was presented to her were 6-pointed, and she suggested that they change it to 5-pointed stars simply because they would be easier to make. She had a special technique of folding fabric so that with one snip of her scissors, she could make a perfect 5-pointed star. And when you visit the Betsy Ross House, Betsy shows you that little trick, and everybody's just in awe of it. For a 13-star flag, you're sewing stars on both the front and the back. That's 26 stars. That's 26 less points. If you're sewing 5-point stars rather than 6-pointed stars, it's a lot easier. So she simply suggested the 5-pointed stars just because it was easier to do. But other than that, we do not give her credit for designing that first American flag. Again, historians generally give Francis Hopkinson that credit, but Congress felt like he was not the person who created that first design either. To answer your second question about whether or not you would have seen the flag flown around a lot back then, not really. Flying the flag on flagpoles, on houses, on military buildings, on libraries, that's more of a modern thing. In Betsy Ross's time, the flag was simply a military tool, and it was a way to identify the American troops on the battlefield and at sea. So you would have found flags flying on ships and carried on the battlefield, but that was about it.
So the Betsy Ross House, is that the site of the reported meeting with George Washington and Betsy Ross? Did it actually happen in that house?
That's what her family says. So they said that after John Ross passed away, they were living at a house on Chestnut Street. After he passed away, she could no longer afford to rent an entire house by herself. So she moved to this Arch Street house, which was a boarding house. And she paid for her bedroom, for the upholstery shop to run her business. And then most likely, food and, cleaning services were included in her room and board. But so that's where she was living and working when she was met by the Flag Committee.
And that was the same building that was later turned into a tavern.
Yes.
That then was later come back to Betsy Ross's house, where the museum and where we can all visit Betsy Ross is today.
Yes. So over the years, it's been many things. It was a shoemaker shop, a general store, a cigar store, a tavern, a number of other things. Lots of different merchants rented the space and ran their own businesses out of that first floor room that's right on the heavily trafficked Arch Street. It was a great place to run a business for hundreds of years, but then became a museum in 1898.
I can't imagine, how old would she have been at the time that she would have met this committee of three?
She was 24.
Because she's a single woman. She was 24.
Yeah.
I can't imagine what that was like. again, we're going to leave space. Do we have the visitor log? No, but I can't imagine what that was like to be approached to say, we'd like you to sew the flag of this new nation. What have you found? Because you, in your roles at the Betsy Ross House, included looking through a lot of the thing, as curator of this museum, which you said is one of the oldest in the country. Is that right? One of the oldest
One of the
houses?
one of the older historic house museums in the country. I believe Mount Vernon is the oldest. But that was, I can't remember exactly when they were founded and turned into a historic house museum. But yeah, Betsy Ross House is one of the older ones.
So what did you find? What did you learn about Betsy going through the different things that you were able to put into the Betsy Ross House?
I am so in awe of her tenacity, and how relatable she is, really. She didn't have any children with John Ross, but when she married Joseph Ashburn, they did have 2 children. And again, she was widowed again before the age of 30, when Joseph Ashburn was taken prisoner and died as a prisoner of war in England. But she was left a single working mom and struggling to make ends meet. She married a 3rd time, but as I said earlier, that husband eventually succumbed to previous war injuries and was no longer able to work. So once again, she was supporting her children. Her grandchildren at that point had moved into her home as well, and her husband, on just using her sewing skills, doing both the upholstery work and then the flag making business. But they struggled so much that she even received charity from the Free Quakers. She received money, shoes for her husband, firewood. She even took a part-time job cleaning the Free Quaker meeting house just to help make ends meet. And that story resonated so much with me because I remember my grandmother had to do something similar. My grandmother was a seamstress. She sewed shirts for a living, but didn't make enough money to make ends meet. So she also took a little side job at night cleaning banks. And I was like, wow, that sounds so much like Betsy's story. Sounds so much like my grandmother's story. But not only that, but she suffered through so much loss in her lifetime. She lost her mother, father, and sister within days of each other in the yellow fever epidemic. She lost her very first daughter, died as an infant. She had her second daughter for only a couple of weeks before her husband went off to sea and never returned, leaving her a very young widow for the second time, obviously still mourning the loss of her daughter and now having a newborn, and you're raising this child by yourself. She did remarry, as I said, and had 5 more daughters with her 3rd husband, John Claypool, but she also lost her last daughter as an infant. So just to think of how much loss she had in her life of very close relatives. I mean, I just think if I lose one person that's that important to me, I would just be a mess. And to think that she lost so many in a short period of time, and she continued to persevere, to work, to take multiple jobs, to support all of these people. I mean, she was really a remarkable woman.
What can we see at the Betsy Ross House? We can visit it. What do we see when we go in there? What's there to learn more about Betsy Ross? And what are some of the things that you love the most to show people?
Right. So I think what makes us so unique as far as historic house museums go is that most historic houses share the story of wealthy, powerful men living on these grand estates out in the country. We are the exact opposite. We're the house of a working class urban woman who ran a little business in a 1,200 square foot row home in this heart of Philadelphia. Again, the exact opposite of what you'd experience at other historic house museums. She was you and me. She was a common person. This is how normal people lived in the 18th century Philadelphia. So you really get to experience what life was like for a middle class person during the Revolutionary War. So the house is furnished to the period in which she lived there, which was 1776 to 1779. We have some things that belong to her. So we have some chairs, a beautiful walnut chest on chest that as a struggling upholsterer, she would not have been able to afford herself, but her father was quite wealthy. And thankfully they did reconcile later in life. And she inherited this walnut chest on chest from him. We've got Betsy's glasses, her petticoat. So things that she personally wore, I think are really special. And I love to share with visitors. But yeah, you basically just get to experience what life was like for an ordinary woman in the 18th century. One of the really cool things we do is that every day you get to meet Betsy Ross. Betsy Ross. We have 3 different actresses who portray Betsy. So when you come to the house, you meet her working in her upholstery shop. We're the only 18th century upholstery shop in the country. Even Colonial Williamsburg doesn't have one. So our Betsy Ross actresses are in their shop, interacting with visitors. We'll never break character. We'll talk to you about her life. We'll answer your questions. Any question you might have, even if it's about a cheesesteak, they have a really interesting way of telling you about how to get a cheesesteak, but without leaving the 18th century. And they're actually working on 18th century upholstery projects. So they're hand stitching curtains and slipcases and mattresses out of 18th century reproduction fabrics using 18th century upholstery techniques. And then we use what they create in the upholstery shop to furnish the Betsy Ross House and to furnish other museums. We've even started taking commissions. So the work of our Betsy Ross actresses can be found in other museums in Philadelphia.
That is so cool. I just had my kids in Philadelphia just randomly, just for a short period of time in December. And we saw the Liberty Bell. And I'm thinking to myself, my kids would love, I would love the Betsy Ross House. Are you kidding? But my kids would love to go. So I could even see planning a special trip just to see this, Lisa. That sounds amazing. And to know that some of the American craftsmanship that is very specific for that time period is still happening, and that you're still spreading that is also really special. As you're talking, I'm just thinking, it may be true that Betsy Ross didn't design. We know that she didn't design the flag, but whoever sews it and whoever does that first one or the first few sets the tone. And if it's someone different or someone not as good, imagine that our entire flag could look different. And obviously our flag has changed a lot over the years, but that was a really important job. And I love learning about how dynamic Betsy is. And I love hearing about your story too, Lisa, about here your grandmother was a seamstress. Is that your grandmother was and here you are now, the director of the house of one of the most famous seamstresses in America. And doesn't that tell an American story in and of itself, the evolution of a family? When you see the flag now, and when you reflect on days like Flag Day or July 4th, what do you see? How has that impacted your work? How's your work impacted how you feel about the flag, how you feel about being an American?
I've been there for so long and I spend so much of my time there. I sometimes forget how special it is until I am reminded by visitors and by people like you who say, like, yeah, it's a really big deal to work at this place. Yeah, I mean, I'm really honored. I'm honored to share her story. I'm honored to have made such an impact on the Betsy Ross House. When I first started there, I'll admit it was not well done. It was considered a tourist trap. It was run by non-museum professionals. There were floor-to-ceiling plexiglass barriers in every room. There were artifacts from like the 19th century, from beyond the time of Betsy's death, that had no business being in the Betsy Ross House. So when I became director, it really gave me an opportunity to shape the interpretation of the house and make sure it's as accurate as possible, and to really highlight that working woman story, which I feel like is the important story to share, to empower other women to persevere by hearing Betsy's story. That's what's really special to me. Whether or not you believe Betsy Ross made the first American flag, I personally think she did. But even if you don't think she did, I think experiencing the Betsy Ross House and understanding Betsy's role and the role of other 18th century women and how important they were to shaping America's history is so important. And like I said, I'm really honored that I've been able to help make that happen.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, we're really grateful, Lisa, and I'm grateful for your expertise. And one of the things we do at Smarter News is, as a nonpartisan news platform, I like to be able to present information to people on all, give multiple angles, and then step away and let them decide. And we'll do that here. We have a certain point. We have a point of view of an expert seeped in Betsy Ross research. We will welcome any other new information and weave that in, perhaps, no pun intended, but I'll leave it to our audience to decide. At this point, after our conversation, I'm leaning towards Betsy. I'm leaning towards Betsy. I might be rooting for her a little bit now too, knowing, as you mentioned, all that she's gone through in her life and the many struggles that she overcame and persevered through, and really a tribute to the American woman of any generation. So, Lisa, great to have you. I look forward to visiting. I hope to meet you in person, and maybe we can show Smarter News the Betsy Ross House in person, which would be really lovely.
That'd be great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Quick, concise, nonpartisan, Smarter News, a refuge from the storm. I'm Jenna. Thank you for choosing Smarter.